So when I was in El Salvador, I asked why were they killed, and why them, and why then? And the why them is because they were known, because they did this work, and it was really dangerous and pretty far afield kind of work. And why then? Because there was a plan at the time. It's ironic because the war lasted for another 12 years, but there was a talk of a final offensive, that the leftists would have this big offensive in January 81, and they would win, and that would end the war. And so the military and the established government was like on a tear to get rid of everybody they could get rid of before that happened. What a lot of other knowledgeable observers say is that Reagan had been elected, in November. He was going to come into office in January, and the administration in El Salvador knew that they would have a friend in the White House, a really good friend in the White House, come January, and they wanted to kind of clean the decks, like do whatever you can do now, because it's not going to really get investigated come a few months from now. And Jimmy Carter, who had made human rights like an element of his foreign policy, was a lame duck, was not going to get anything done in the last month of office. So those are the answers I get for like why them and why at that moment. I think the larger reason is that they were worth killing. They were dangerous enough to the government in El Salvador that they were worth killing. And I say that they're dangerous, and Melinda Roper said that they were dangerous because they were doing this work of telling people that they were worthwhile, right? They were telling poor people and oppressed people that God loved them and that they had a right as a child of God to have a decent life. That they should not be living as servants in their own country, that they should be able to determine their own future, that they should be able to determine their own government, and that they should live in far better conditions than they were living in. And Mora wasn't doing this from a platform, right? Or in order to get votes for a party, or in order to recruit people to the armed movements. She was doing this in this intensely intimate, personal, soul-to-soul sort of way. You are worthwhile. God loves you. I love you. I want better for you. And that, I think, is truly dangerous because it's really getting to people's hearts. Really getting people to understand. If you can mix the deep faith that I think most people have, or most people are drawn to some notion of divinity, and you mix that with some notion that you can stand up and be something, and you are worthy, and you have a opportunity to connect with your neighbors, that's really serious stuff. That's really dangerous stuff. So I would argue, based on the reporting I've done, that that's what happened, and that's why they were killed, because they were destabilizing in a very almost metaphysical way to the power structure there. And now we should shout questions at each other. All right. Is that me? Okay. All right. So what do we say?
Actually about the why that, so I was wondering if in your research, experts that the intent wasn't to kill them that day, that it was prepare them, and maybe I missed this, I'm sorry if I did.
Right.
Hope that they leave on their own and
oh, interesting.
I didn't know if you found that in your research, or if it was wiping them out completely, or...
That's interesting. I haven't heard that. In October, so they were killed in December. In October, there was a threat posted on the door of the building where they lived, where Morenita anyway lived, in Chalatenango, that said, with a picture of a face with a knife through the head and blood coming down, saying everyone who works in this house is a communist and will be killed. And that was the parish house. It meant the priests and the Salvadoran sisters who worked there, these North Americans who worked there, and the sacristan and the rest of the parish team. That was this direct threat then. And it was signed by the Maximo, one of these death squad brigades, right? And then on December 2nd in the morning, the priest in Chalatenango, where Morenita anyway worked, got a list, was handed a note with a list of names, said these people will be killed, it starts today. I've been unable to connect that threat to the actual murder. It's a different battalion, it's a different place, it's different people who were working in San Salvador and killed them versus who were up there in the countryside. But those were two very serious death threats, not please go home now threats, you know? They also, I mean, they were all shot. That's not, you know, that's not like an interrogation that got out of hand, you know? So I don't know. Yeah. Anybody else?
So how does their legacy speak to kind of the continual economic inequality that continues today, particularly still in Central South America and maybe other parts of the world?
The first part of your question, how does
sort of their legacy speak to potentially movements today in Central South America?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think their legacy speaks in those places to this recognition of humanity and this recognition of the power of collective action, but it hasn't gotten, it hasn't gotten all better. I think people who know more about Central American history and the details of El Salvador and Nicaragua could speak more knowledgeably than I about progress that has been made. And there's certainly been, I think in Nicaragua you could certainly say that the conditions are better than they were. And maybe you could say that in El Salvador, although most people clearly are still very poor in both countries. I think one of the biggest legacies here in the U.S. is all these North Americans who heard this story in confirmation class or in some retreat or in their parish and went and became inner city school teachers or public defense attorneys or went in the Peace Corps. And in Nicaragua, the legacy of Mora was really, really personal, at least what I found. It was this deep love that people who knew her had and felt, and oh, there was somebody once who really loved me and acknowledged me and thought I was important. And that continues to be really powerful. And then they have long and complicated stories about the politics that happened after 1980. But I mean, and maybe you guys all who worked in El Salvador could speak to this, there's so many stories like this in El Salvador, right? But that this is one because they didn't have to be there, and yet they stayed. That is inspiring to people. And the social movements that they worked with continue, right, in different forms. But there's still all these, in some cases, really interestingly well-organized communities of people who had been evacuated, who then came back to the country together and have all this village-level democracy and do all the kinds of work that's very much like community organizing we see here, right? That's very much like tenant organizing stuff. And that's not because of the church women. The church women is because of that. But there's still these social movements happening in those countries. And in some cases, the governments are better than others, but there's still that movement going on. And, and you could talk to somebody who knows way more than I about victories along the way in those movements. Yeah.
So you mentioned that their deaths were in every newspaper and it was all over the place, and yet I feel like people have forgotten the story, right? And yet, not to downplay him, but I think John Lennon was also killed in 1980, and yet we still talk about his death.
The next week,
oh my God, it was so tragic, and we still remember it, and people gather at Strawberry Fields. And yet it seems like the story of these four women has kind of gotten forgotten.
Yeah.
Any idea why you think something that was all over the place now has kind of disappeared from the dialogue?
Yeah. There's kind of three, right? It's no longer news. It was 34 years ago, so it's not news. As journalists, we write about things that are new. And secondly, it's a harder story, right? If you like the Beatles and you thought John Lennon was a great artist, it's easy to remember him. This is a story that calls you to complicated reactions or to uncomfortable reactions. And so it's harder. It's always easy to remember something, right, that was terrible that John Lennon was killed by a crazy person. You don't have to sacrifice anything to be loyal to that story.